He said his sister made him do it. That was the sentence whispered by a court clerk to a journalist just seconds after Nick Reiner's tear-soaked confession stunned the entire courtroom into silence. Yes, that Reiner. Rob Reiner. Hollywood royalty. Director of When Harry Met Sally, Stand By Me, and The Princess Bride. A man beloved by millions, respected by titans, and, until a few weeks ago, believed to be enjoying his golden years in peace with his wife Michelle at their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But now, everything is shattered. 2 brutal murders, 1 son in cuffs, and a daughter in the witness box who may have seen it all coming. What in the world happened? That's exactly what this expose will uncover. Because the story you've heard, about a mentally unstable son, about a tragic family dispute, about another Hollywood tragedy, is only the surface. What lies beneath is something far darker, something that involves power, control, long-buried secrets, and, perhaps most chillingly of all, the suggestion that this murder wasn't an impulsive breakdown at all. It was planned, orchestrated, and if you believe what Nick Reiner said in court, pressured by someone very close to the family, his sister, Tracy Reiner. Let that sink in. A daughter of Tinseltown, known for playing innocent characters in films like A League of Their Own, allegedly part of a real-life narrative that rivals anything ever written in Hollywood. And it all came crashing down with 2 bodies, a blood-soaked hallway, and a handwritten confession that no one expected, least of all, the police. But to truly understand this story, we need to rewind, step by step, through the red carpet illusions and into the silent corridors of a family falling apart. Let's begin, because once you hear what led up to that terrible night, you'll never see the Reiner family the same way again. And more importantly, you'll start to wonder just how much of what we call family is real, or just very, very good acting. The Reiner image, a Hollywood hall of mirrors. For decades, the Reiner name stood as a symbol of liberal ideals, comedic brilliance, and emotional warmth. From Carl Reiner, Rob's father and comedy legend, to Rob's own directorial hits, the family seemed wrapped in cinematic gold. Michelle Singer, Rob's wife, was no slouch either. Though more private, she produced several critically acclaimed films and helped manage the family's brand behind the scenes. They were partners in art, politics, and parenting. Their 3 children, Tracy, Romy, and Nick, were often described in interviews as grounded, introspective, and creative. A rarity in the industry, but here's what no one saw coming. Behind those staged smiles and coordinated interviews, something was festering, something that would explode in the worst way imaginable. Because on the surface, the Reiners were royalty, but in reality, they were a fractured dynasty, a house full of locked doors and emotional landmines. And the guest house? That's where Nick Reiner lived, and where everything began to spiral. The guest house that became a pressure cooker. You know what's strange? A 32-year-old man living in a guest house on his parents' estate wouldn't usually raise eyebrows in Los Angeles. But Nick Reiner wasn't your typical Hollywood heir. He was a recovering addict, a former rehab patient, and, perhaps most importantly, a writer with a sharp tongue and a burning resentment toward his family. He once co-wrote a semi-autobiographical film about a troubled young man trying to escape his father's expectations. That film, ironically, was produced by his real-life dad. Critics called it honest. Some called it brave. But insiders? They called it a cry for help. According to multiple family friends who have since come forward, Nick's relationship with his parents, particularly his father, was strained at best, volatile at worst. Rob reportedly paid for multiple stints in rehab. Michelle allegedly installed a high-tech security system to track who came and went from the guest house. And Tracy? Well, Tracy was often described as the enforcer, the one who ensured Nick stayed in line. But the question is, in line with what exactly? We'll get to that. Just know this. Weeks before the murders, something changed in the household. Nick stopped answering calls. Michelle was seen crying on a private walk around the block. And Tracy was visiting more frequently than usual, often late at night. Then, everything stopped. Because one Sunday morning, 2 people were found dead. And the only person seen entering and exiting the house that day was Nick. The call that shattered everything. Romy Reiner, the youngest of the siblings, was the one who made the call. She wasn't supposed to be at the house that day, but thank God she was. According to official dispatch records, the 911 call came in at 6:48 p.m. on a quiet Sunday. Romy's voice was shaking, breathless. "There's blood," she said. "They're not breathing. Please." I think it was someone we know. That phrase, "someone we know," would become the fulcrum of this entire case. Because from the moment police arrived at the Brentwood estate and saw what had been done, they suspected this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't some random act of violence. It was intimate, brutal, personal. Both Rob and Michelle Reiner had suffered multiple stab wounds. The coroner would later list multiple sharp force injuries as the cause of death. Nothing was stolen. No forced entry. Security footage missing key gaps. And the one person unaccounted for during that window? Nick. But when officers found him later that night in the guest house, he didn't resist. He didn't scream. He was reportedly seated cross-legged on the floor, staring at a framed photo of his parents. His eyes were swollen, his voice quiet. "You're here for me," he said. "She told me you would be." When police asked who she was, Nick didn't answer. Not right away. That would come later, in court, and it would blow everything wide open. The confession heard around the world. 3 days later, the Reiner estate was surrounded by media vans. Candlelight vigils were held. Hollywood tweeted its condolences. Directors, actors, and producers praised Rob's legacy and called the event an unthinkable tragedy. But inside the courthouse, a different story was playing out. Nick Reiner, now clean-shaven and wearing the same navy blazer he wore to his high school graduation, entered the courtroom. He looked calm, until the judge asked one question. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Nick's lips trembled. And then, before his lawyer could stop him, Nick did something that froze the entire room. He said, "Yes, I did it. But I didn't want to. Tracy made me." Gasps. Audible cries. Even reporters stopped typing. The prosecution scrambled. The defense attorney tried to cut him off. But Nick kept talking. "She told me they were trying to erase me from everything. She said Mom changed the will. She said if I didn't do something, I'd be out on the street." He broke down sobbing. And just like that, this wasn't just a murder case. This was a family implosion. A story about legacy, control, and betrayal. And the courtroom was only the beginning. Because as more evidence came in, text messages, journal entries, security footage, it became clearer and clearer. This wasn't a one-person act. It was a descent, a manipulation, a plan, one that Nick claimed Tracy orchestrated. But was he telling the truth? Or was it just another delusion from a troubled mind? That's the question we'll unravel over the next chapters. And trust me, you'll want to stay for all of it. Because what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Can you really trust the image of family projects to the world, especially when that family was built by Hollywood itself? For decades, the Reiner family was held up as an example of what Hollywood royalty could look like when done right. Charming, artful, politically active, and most of all, tight-knit. But behind those elegant red carpet photos and public smiles was a truth far more complicated. Because when the cameras weren't rolling and the interviews stopped, the Reiners weren't living in a fairy tale. They were walking a tightrope, one that had frayed for years. And ultimately, it snapped. But let's go back to the beginning, before blood stained the hallways of the Brentwood estate. Before a son cried in court and accused his sister of making him kill. Let's look at how the House of Reiner was built. And how, from its earliest bricks, cracks were already forming. The Reiner legacy, a spotlight that never dimmed. To understand the emotional weight of what happened in that courtroom, we need to rewind, not just a few months or years, but decades. It starts with Carl Reiner. Comedy legend, writer, actor, the man behind the Dick Van Dyke Show. Carl Reiner helped shape American entertainment for generations. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was a foundation of the entire industry. His son, Rob Reiner, inherited not just Carl's wit, but his ambition. From the moment Rob broke out as meathead on All in the Family, it was clear he had something more, something deeper, something raw. And then he became a director. Not just any director, the director. He gave the world Stand By Me, Misery, A Few Good Men, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally. a string of genre-defining films that cemented him as a master of emotional storytelling. To the outside world, Rob wasn't just Carl's son. He was his own force of nature. And alongside him, Michelle Singer, Rob's wife. Intelligent, graceful, a film producer with an eye for meaningful stories and a reputation for quiet elegance. Together, they built an empire. But here's where the image starts to bend. Because while the Reiners projected the glow of creative perfection, their home life was anything but simple. A patchwork family or a powder keg. Rob and Michelle's family was blended in a way many Hollywood households are. Tracy Reiner, Rob's adopted daughter from his marriage to Penny Marshall, was the eldest. Raised amid spotlights and studios, Tracy was a fixture on movie sets before she could ride a bike. Then came Nick Reiner, born in 1992. The golden boy on paper, but in truth, a child who struggled with identity, expectation, and addiction from an early age. And finally, Romy, the youngest, the quiet one, the observer. 3 siblings, 3 different mothers, 3 vastly different relationships with the Reiner name. But if you were to listen to old interviews, you'd never know there was trouble. Rob would call his kids his world. Michelle would praise their intelligence and creativity. Tracy appeared in several of her father's films. Romy kept a low profile, choosing the arts but from behind the scenes. And Nick? Nick was the wild card, the one the tabloids kept a closer eye on, the one whose relationship with Rob teetered between fiery confrontation and icy silence. Why? Because Nick never felt like he could live up to the legacy. And worse, he never stopped believing that someone in his own family didn't want him to. The public image versus private chaos. Let's zoom in on the Reiner family's media presence. You'll notice something strange. Despite Rob's fame, and despite their children's involvement in the entertainment industry, there were shockingly few candid interviews or in-depth profiles on the entire family together. Almost no joint family interviews. Very few red carpet appearances as a full unit. Always piecemeal. Always curated. Was that intentional? Insiders now say yes. According to a former studio assistant who worked with Michelle in the mid-2000s, Michelle was fiercely protective of the family's privacy. But there was also a real effort to control the narrative, especially when it came to Nick. Even during Nick's brief moments in the spotlight, like co-writing the 2015 film Being Charlie, which explored a young man's drug addiction, the family's presence was oddly muted. Rob supported the film, even helped produce it. But when asked about the film's autobiographical elements, he dodged the question. So did Nick. But those who really watched saw something else. A cry for help. A cinematic confessional. A young man saying, "I'm drowning, and I don't know who's holding my head underwater." Was it his own mind? Or was it someone else? Tracy's role. Sibling or silent strategist. Now we come to Tracy. To many, she was the calm one. The mature sister. The one who stayed out of the headlines, stayed grounded, stayed classy. But whispers about Tracy's controlling nature weren't new. Former staffers from the Reiner household, who are now speaking anonymously in the aftermath of the murders, described Tracy as dominant, overly involved, and terrifying when crossed. She wasn't abusive, one source clarified. She was just everywhere, watching, managing, like the family ran on her approval. And perhaps most disturbingly, several noted that Nick always seemed anxious when Tracy visited, like he was walking on eggshells, like something unspoken passed between them. Now, in hindsight, those moments feel more chilling than coincidental, especially when Nick later claimed that Tracy had groomed him emotionally for years. But groomed him for what? To protect the family name? To eliminate a threat? Or something else entirely? The estate, a fortress with crumbling foundations. The Brentwood mansion wasn't just a home. It was a symbol. 13,500 square feet of modern luxury. Manicured gardens. Floor-to-ceiling glass. A separate guest house designed as a retreat. But if walls could talk, they'd tell you a very different story. That guest house, where Nick had been living for nearly 2 years, became a place of both refuge and torment. He rarely left. He barely spoke to his parents unless summoned. Tracy visited more than anyone else. And Romy? She stayed away. According to friends, she couldn't handle the tension in the house. Yet no one intervened. Because to the outside world, everything was fine. Until it wasn't. The first cracks that everyone ignored. In the months leading up to the murders, something changed. Neighbors heard yelling. Nick was spotted pacing the backyard late at night, talking to himself. Security logs show repeated, unexplained visits by Tracy, sometimes at 2 or 3 a.m. Rob canceled 2 major public appearances. Michelle stopped posting to her charity's social media accounts. Something was happening, and Romy noticed. In a heartbreaking message to a friend just 2 weeks before the tragedy, she wrote, "I don't know what's going on over there, but it feels like something's about to explode. I don't trust Tracy, and I think Nick is falling apart again. I'm scared. For everyone." That message would be submitted into evidence during the trial. And when it was read aloud, gasps filled the courtroom. Because in just a few lines, Romy had captured what no one else had dared say. That behind the glitz, behind the Reiner name, was something festering, something dangerous, and no one had stopped it. But what came next would make everything worse. Because as the Reiner family tiptoed around each other in a house that had long since stopped being a home, one decision, one conversation, would tip Nick over the edge. And it wasn't between him and his parents. It was with Tracy. And it would change everything. Forever. What happens when the black sheep of a Hollywood dynasty gets locked in a guest house and starts believing he's the enemy? That's the question the world is now asking about Nick Reiner. He was never supposed to be the family's downfall. He was supposed to be its redemption story. The struggling son who turned it around. The troubled teen who found his voice and rewrote his fate. At least, that's what the press releases said. But the truth? Nick never escaped the storm. He lived inside it. Every day, every night, and eventually, it consumed him and everyone around him. Because his spiral didn't begin with a single moment. It began with a pattern, a slow erosion of trust, connection, and mental clarity. And it all culminated in one horrifying act. So how did Nick Reiner, the son of one of Hollywood's most beloved icons, go from promising writer to murder suspect? Let's go deeper, into the heart of the spiral. And into the mind of a man who felt more imprisoned inside his own family than by any courtroom. The golden boy with cracked glass eyes. From the outside, Nick Reiner had every advantage. Wealth, fame, access, education, resources. But none of those could shield him from what he later called a lifelong shadow I could never outrun. That shadow, being Rob Reiner's son. In interviews, Nick rarely referred to his father by name. Instead, he used titles like the director or him. Always with a mix of reverence and resentment. You could hear it in his voice, this tug of war between admiration and aching alienation. Because Nick wasn't just raised in his father's shadow. He was drowned in it. The early years, pressure, pills, and pain. Nick's struggles with addiction began shockingly early. By 15, he had reportedly tried marijuana, alcohol, Xanax, and cocaine. By 17, he was in his second rehab stint. By 18, he had already overdosed once and survived. Rob and Michelle did what parents with means often do. They spared no expense. The best rehab facilities, top-tier therapists, private schooling when necessary. But none of it worked. Because underneath the substance abuse was something more complicated. A war of identity. Nick wasn't just trying to numb the pain. He was trying to carve out space for himself in a family where, by his own account, he wasn't allowed to fail privately. Every mistake became a crisis. Every relapse, a scandal waiting to erupt. And looming over it all, Tracy, the enforcer or the guardian. Depending on who you ask, Tracy Reiner was either the only adult in the room or the family's most terrifying figure. She kept order, said one former therapist. She played God, said a former assistant. As the eldest sibling, Tracy took on the role of surrogate parent during Nick's darker years. She coordinated interventions, made treatment decisions when Rob and Michelle were overwhelmed. She was the one calling facilities, checking insurance, arranging transportation. But she wasn't just managing his recovery. She was managing him. And, as Nick would later write in a private journal entry, she made me feel like a lab rat. Watched, controlled, measured, judged. Did she do it out of love? Or out of something else? Power? Punishment? We still don't fully know. But one thing is certain. Nick felt caged. And that feeling only intensified when he was moved into the guest house. The guest house. A gilded prison. Let's talk about the guest house. On paper, it was a luxury space. 2,000 square feet. Kitchenette. Private entrance. Garden access. A wellness retreat. as the real estate listing would later call it. But to Nick, it was a sentence, a polite way of saying, "You're not welcome in the main house." And over time, that message began to fester. Neighbors rarely saw Nick. Delivery drivers dropped packages at the gate. He ordered food but rarely answered the door. Security logs show weeks at a time with no movement from the main house to the guest house. No family dinners. No visits from Rob or Michelle. Only Tracy. Always Tracy. Short visits. Sometimes just 10 minutes. Sometimes hours. And always, afterward, Nick would disappear for days. Lights off. Blinds drawn. Calls unanswered. The writing that revealed everything. Nick's last known public project was Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical film he co-wrote with his father. It premiered in 2015, a story about a young man struggling with addiction, trying to define himself outside his famous father's shadow. Sound familiar? Critics called it raw and unflinching. But behind the scenes, the process was a disaster. Nick reportedly clashed with producers, resisted rewrites, and disappeared during filming. It was his story, but he felt like it was being stolen. "I gave them my life," Nick allegedly said to a friend, "and they turned it into a plot device." After that film, Nick stopped writing publicly, but he never stopped journaling. And those journals, later submitted into evidence, paint a harrowing picture. The descent into delusion. In the months before the murders, Nick's journals took a sharp turn. From reflective entries to paranoid rants. From sketches of story ideas to cryptic references to watchers, silent orders, and the architect. Who was the architect? According to prosecutors, Nick told his public defender it was Tracy. "She's pulling the strings," he whispered. "She decides who stays in the will, who disappears. Delusion or coded truth?" Psychiatrists would later debate that in court. But here's what we do know. In those journals, Nick wrote that Tracy was the key. He claimed she had convinced him that their parents were going to cut him out of the family. He believed Rob and Michelle were about to change their will, and that if they did, he would lose everything. Not just money, but identity, family, the last threads holding him together. And in that belief, whether planted or imagined, something broke. A visit that changed everything. 2 days before the murders, Tracy visited the guest house at 10:46 p.m. Security logs confirm it. She stayed for 47 minutes. No one knows what was said, but the next day, neighbors reported hearing loud music coming from Nick's unit. Not party music, opera, screeching violins. At full volume, one neighbor said it felt like something was boiling over. And then, silence. Until Sunday night, when Romy found the bodies. And the guest house was once again quiet. But inside, a spiral had ended, and something far worse had taken its place. And what police found next would shatter the story and set the stage for a courtroom confession no one saw coming. What if the real mastermind wasn't the one holding the knife, but the one holding the strings? That's what the courtroom began to whisper as Nick Reiner's confession unfolded. "I did it, but Tracy told me to." 7 words. 7 words that turned a Hollywood horror story into something far more twisted. Because when the public first heard that Rob and Michelle Reiner had been murdered, the natural assumption was that their unstable son had finally snapped. Years of addiction, isolation, resentment, a mental break. But when Nick named his sister, the narrative shattered, and suddenly, the spotlight turned to Tracy Reiner, the seemingly stable daughter, the accomplished actress, the one who kept the family together. But was that who she really was? Or had she just been hiding in plain sight? This is where the story takes a sinister turn. Because as prosecutors peeled back the layers of Tracy's life, they uncovered something unsettling. Tracy wasn't just a bystander in the Reiner household. She was the gatekeeper, the manager, the enforcer, and, if you believe what Nick wrote in his journal, the architect of it all. So who is Tracy Reiner, really? Let's find out. The star nobody watched closely enough. Tracy Reiner was born into Hollywood. Literally. Her mother was the late Penny Marshall, the beloved actress and director behind Big and A League of Their Own. Her biological father was Michael Henry, but at age 7, she was adopted by Rob Reiner. And from that moment on, she carried the weight of 2 legacies, the Marshalls and the Reiners. Tracy appeared in more than 20 films, often small roles, always close to home. She wasn't chasing fame like others. She played nurses, friends, background characters, always present, never prominent. And that's the first clue. Tracy liked proximity to power. Not spotlight. Not applause. Control. Behind the scenes, she was known as meticulous, organized, and scary smart. Friends from childhood described her as the fixer of the family, the one who took care of everyone's messes, even when they didn't ask her to. And when Nick spiraled, she didn't step away. She stepped in, the guardian or the gatekeeper. As Nick's addiction worsened, Tracy took charge of his care. She picked his rehab facilities. She signed off on which therapists he saw. She even allegedly arranged for him to be cut off financially, twice. She treated him like a project, said one former family friend. But not with cruelty. With calculation. I think she believed she was helping, the friend added. But in her mind, helping meant control. And that control extended beyond Nick. Court documents would later reveal that Tracy held durable power of attorney over certain financial decisions for the Reiner household, including aspects of the estate, including trust disbursements, including, possibly, the will. And if Nick was right, if Tracy told him that their parents were changing that will, she may have had something to lose, and a motive to act. The visit no one can explain. We already talked about the 47-minute visit Tracy made to Nick's guest house 2 days before the murders. But what we haven't discussed yet, what she was carrying. Security footage shows her arriving with a sealed manila envelope. She left without it. What was in that envelope? No one knows for sure. But prosecutors now believe it contained financial documents. Possibly an early draft of a new will. Nick's journal from that day includes one chilling line. She showed me the paper. Said it was proof. Said they were cutting me out. Said she tried to stop it. Said I had to do something. Was it true? Did such a document exist? The Reiner's legal team has denied it. But the timing? The visit? The envelope? It all lines up. And that's why, during the preliminary hearings, the judge allowed prosecutors to introduce Tracy as a person of interest. Not a suspect. Not yet. But not innocent either. Emails, pressure, and the art of gaslighting. As the investigation deepened, detectives uncovered emails between Tracy and Nick spanning several years. Some were mundane, birthday wishes, check-ins. But others? They were disturbing. Don't embarrass the family again. They won't protect you forever. If you can't pull it together, you don't deserve a seat at the table. And in one particularly cryptic message sent just 3 days before the murders, sometimes the only way out is through. You know what I mean. What did she mean? Nick thought he knew. And that's what haunts investigators now. Because taken individually, these messages could be read as tough love. Taken together, they read like a slow drip of manipulation. A psychological vice, tightening day by day. Until something snapped. A witness changes everything. Then came the surprise witness. A former housekeeper named Lydia Santiago, who worked at the Reiner estate for over 5 years. She left quietly in 2025 after a disagreement with Tracy. But after the murders, she came forward. And what she told detectives flipped the investigation upside down. She claimed Tracy and Michelle had fought bitterly in the weeks before their deaths. Michelle was going to change the will, Lydia said. She told me she was afraid of what Tracy would do. Lydia also recalled hearing Tracy yell at Nick in the garden one night. You think you deserve anything? You're a stain I keep cleaning up. That quote was entered into court testimony. The courtroom went silent, because it was the first outside voice suggesting that Tracy's relationship with Nick wasn't just strained. It was volatile, and toxic, and possibly explosive. But when Tracy finally took the stand, everything changed again. And what she said, no one was prepared for. How does a peaceful Sunday morning turn into a double homicide by nightfall? That was the question police asked as they stepped across the blood-soaked marble floor of Rob and Michelle Reiner's Brentwood estate. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken, no signs of forced entry, only silence. And the 2 bodies that used to be the pillars of Hollywood's most admired family. But what happened that day, minute by minute, isn't just shocking. It's haunting. Because the deeper you dive into the timeline of the murders, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was something else. Premeditated, calculated, personal. And the only person who could piece together the timeline in those crucial hours was also the one standing over their bodies, Nick Reiner. So let's go back. Let's walk through the final day of Rob and Michelle Reiner, hour by hour, until everything fell apart. 8 a.m., the quiet before. Sunday morning began like most in Brentwood: clear skies, birdsong, and the hum of early coffee pots. Security logs confirm Rob and Michelle woke around 7:45 a.m. Their bedroom blinds were electronically opened at 8:02. At 8:17, Michelle sent a cheerful group text to her 3 children. Brunch at 10:30. Dad's making pancakes. Bring your appetites and no drama. Please face with tears of joy, red heart. Only one person responded. Romy. Tracy didn't reply. Nick never even opened it. 10:34 a.m. The last normal moment. Footage from the estate's interior security cameras captured the family's final shared moment. Michelle and Rob are in the kitchen. Rob's flipping pancakes. Michelle's dancing to music from a nearby speaker, something soft, jazzy. Romy enters through the side door, smiling, hair damp from the shower. She hugs her parents. The timestamp reads 10 hours, 34 minutes, and 52 seconds. That's the last footage of them alive. At least, together. 11:15 a.m. The first disruption. Romy leaves the house to meet a friend for a hike. She exits through the side gate and waves at the exterior camera. Nick has not yet appeared. But what happened next raises serious questions. At 11:32 a.m., the backyard camera captures Tracy Reiner entering through the rear garden gate. She is carrying a bag. She's alone. No one buzzed her in. She had a key. Tracy disappears from camera view for 23 minutes. At 11:55 a.m., she's seen exiting the guest house. Then gone. She does not re-enter the main house. At least not on camera. 12 p.m., something changes. From 12 to 2 p.m., nothing notable happens on camera. But something shifts. At 1:48 p.m., Rob is seen pacing in the hallway. On his phone, visibly upset. An audio-enhanced snippet from security footage, recovered later, captures him saying, "It's not up to her. It never was. The papers are signed." Police believe he was talking about the will. Or Tracy. Or both. 2:23 p.m., Nick emerges. For the first time that day, Nick is seen exiting the guest house. He's barefoot, wearing a gray hoodie. He walks into the main house, through the kitchen door, unlocked. He stays inside for just under 17 minutes. At 2:40 p.m., he returns to the guest house carrying what appears to be a brown envelope. This is critical, because that envelope would later test positive for Rob and Michelle's DNA. 3:14 p.m., the phone call no one answered. Romy calls her mother at 3:14 p.m. No answer. She texts, "Hey, did you eat without me? I'm bringing smoothies." There's no response. At 3:47 p.m., she tries again. Still nothing. She assumes they're napping. But they weren't. 4:21 p.m., the music starts. Neighbors report hearing loud classical music blasting from the guest house. Opera, strings, something intense. One neighbor later described it as eerie, like the soundtrack to a murder scene. The music lasts for exactly 33 minutes. Then, silence. 5:06 p.m., the power flickers. This detail almost went unnoticed, but it matters. At 5:06 p.m., the estate's security system logs a 7-second power dip, enough to cause 3 cameras to briefly glitch. When footage resumes, the interior living room feed is down. Permanently. The cable had been cut. Only one person knew where the line ran. Nick. 5:12 p.m., a figure in the hall. A blurred shape crosses the hallway outside Rob and Michelle's bedroom. The figure wears a hoodie, barefoot, carrying something shiny. A kitchen knife? The footage is grainy. Police believe this is the moment of the murders. No screams are heard, just the sound of breaking glass. Then silence. 5:47 p.m., the calm after carnage. Nick is seen on the back patio, shirtless. He's smoking, staring straight ahead. The sun is setting. Blood is visible on the side of his arm, and he doesn't move for 27 minutes. 6:18 p.m., Romy returns. Romy's car pulls into the driveway. She enters the house through the side door. Her scream is picked up by the newly reactivated hallway camera at 6:21 p.m. Mom, Dad, then vomiting, then frantic footsteps. She dials 911. The call lasts 4 minutes. She tells the dispatcher, "I think it was my brother. I think he killed them. I told Mom this would happen. I told her." Police arrive 7 minutes later. 6:48 p.m., the arrest. Officers find Nick sitting cross-legged on the floor of the guest house. Still shirtless. Still staring. Still silent. On the floor beside him, the knife, and a note, scrawled in jagged handwriting. She told me to. They were going to erase me. He doesn't resist. Doesn't speak. Until the cuffs are on. Then he looks up at Detective Harper and says, "She wins." When asked who she is, he responds, "Who do you think?" And that's when the story exploded. Because as police dug deeper, the evidence suggested Nick wasn't the only one who knew this was coming. Someone else did too. Someone who'd been orchestrating the storm from behind the scenes all along. What if the killer told you everything before he even did it? When police combed through Nick Reiner's guest house after the murders, they were looking for the obvious: bloody clothes, weapons, drugs. What they found instead was far more chilling. A journal, not hidden, not locked away. Just sitting out on the desk, right beside a half-empty mug of cold coffee and a burned-out candle. It was black, leather-bound, pages yellowed at the edges. Some torn, some stained. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than the scribblings of a recovering addict, a private outlet for pain, self-reflection, and the mental fog of withdrawal. But the deeper investigators read, the more it became something else entirely. A roadmap, a confession, a manifesto laced with paranoia, obsession, and one recurring character. "She's the one who taught me to smile while bleeding." That line was repeated 4 times. And every time, it was followed by the same name. Tracy. This chapter isn't just about a journal. It's about a mind unraveling in real time. And whether it unraveled on its own, or was slowly pulled apart by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The first page, "She says I'm broken." The journal opens on an entry dated August 13th, 2025, nearly 9 months before the murders. Nick writes, "Tracy says I'm broken, but fixable, like a dog that bites. She's been visiting more lately, says she wants to help, but help always feels like control. Already, there's an edge, a power dynamic, a recurring theme. Help, that feels like surveillance. Support, that feels like suffocation." This was not a warm sibling bond. It was something darker, tighter, and maybe even deadly. Early entries, pain and paranoia. Throughout August and September, Nick's entries swing wildly between self-loathing and rage. He accuses himself of being a failure, a burden, a ghost in my own house. But then, just a few pages later, he accuses others. "Mom wants me gone. Dad thinks I'm a headline waiting to happen. But Tracy, she needs me weak. That's how she wins." That last line stood out to detectives, because the winning part implied a game, a strategy. One Nick believed he was losing, but who was playing? And what were the rules? October, the shift begins. In October, the tone changes. Nick starts talking about preparation. He uses military terms, assets, orders, recon. At first, it sounds like fiction, maybe the outline for a script. But then, names start appearing. Real ones. Michelle, Rob, Tracy, Romy. He sketches the layout of the Brentwood estate. He outlines the security system. What times the guards switch shifts, where the cameras are blind. And he writes this. "She says it has to look like a break. Not a rage. Clean. Fast. But poetic." Police believe this refers to Tracy. Nick never says, "Tracy told me to kill them." But over and over, he attributes plans, ideas, and warnings to her. "She says if I don't do this, I'll lose everything. She says they're going to erase me. She says the guest house is a cage, and the key is soaked in blood." Was he hearing voices? Was he imagining this influence? Or was someone actually planting these ideas? That question tore the courtroom in half. The envelope page, one entry, dated December 3rd, refers to a specific object. "She'll bring the envelope tonight. Said it's proof. Said it will make everything clear." That same night, Tracy was logged entering the guest house just before midnight. She stayed 31 minutes. What envelope? What was inside? And why was it never recovered? Prosecutors argued it contained a forged will. Defense attorneys claimed it was nothing more than delusion. But Nick's journal mentions it 5 more times, each time with more urgency. The paper proves intent. She circled the names, mine wasn't there. She cried. First time I've seen her cry. Said she was sorry. Said this was the only way left. Real? Or fantasy? We still don't know. But that envelope, if it existed, may be the key to the entire motive. The final week. Descent into obsession. The entries from the week of the murders are the most disturbing. Nick stops referring to days, stops using punctuation. The writing becomes frantic, slanted, erratic. Some pages are just repeating lines. I am not the enemy. The silence is the answer. She will thank me later. Then, one page, written in red ink. They died in her dreams already. I'm just catching up. A few pages later, he writes. She said I was made for this. That all the pain led here. That this is redemption. And finally, the last entry. She said goodbye before I did it. She said she couldn't watch. Said it had to be me. The sketches, a chilling visual trail. Alongside the entries were sketches. Distorted faces. Knives. Blood pools. Eyes crossed out. One sketch labeled Mom shows Michelle with her mouth sewn shut. Another, titled Dad, shows Rob with a chess piece stabbed through his chest. But the most haunting? A stick figure-style drawing of a woman with her hands outstretched. She's smiling, but her eyes are blacked out. Underneath, Nick wrote, "The architect," the same term he whispered to police during his arrest. Was this Tracy? Or the personification of his psychosis? The psychiatrist's conclusion. At trial, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Dana Lurie was called to analyze the journal. Her assessment? Nick Reiner was not insane in the legal sense, but he was mentally compromised, highly suggestible, emotionally unstable, and potentially subject to coercive influence. Then she added this. This journal reads less like a killer's confession and more like a soldier's orders. The courtroom went quiet, because that's exactly what Nick had described. A mission, assigned by someone he trusted, someone he feared, and someone who, according to him, was pulling every string. And the next piece of evidence would only deepen the mystery. Because inside Nick's guest house, tucked beneath the mattress, police found a printed email, one that had been ripped in half, but not completely destroyed. And what it said changed everything. What if the motive was never madness, but money? For all the talk of mental illness, manipulation, and a fractured family legacy, there's one undeniable force that has shaped the Reiner tragedy from the shadows. Control. And where there's control, there's always cash behind it. From the very beginning, investigators suspected that the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner were not just personal, they were profitable. Not random, not reckless, but financial. And in the center of the financial web, a carefully constructed estate plan, a revised trust, and, allegedly, a fierce behind-the-scenes battle for power. Because once police began following the paper trail, they found something jaw-dropping. A change in Rob and Michelle's joint estate plan, quietly submitted just weeks before the murders, one that significantly altered the distribution of their massive fortune, and the person who stood to lose the most, Nick, unless he acted before it went through. Let's break this down, because this isn't just about inheritance. It's about motives. And murder, the Reiner fortune, more than just Hollywood glitz. Rob Reiner wasn't just a filmmaker. He was an institution. With directing credits on some of the most profitable and beloved films in American cinema, Rob's net worth was estimated at $110 million by 2025. Michelle, a respected producer in her own right, brought in additional millions through family investments, property holdings, and executive production deals. Combined, they were worth over $135 million. But their true empire wasn't just in cash. It was in real estate, residuals, intellectual property, and Hollywood equity. Long-term revenue streams from hits like A Few Good Men, The Princess Bride, and This Is Spinal Tap. And tucked inside that empire, a trust fund with very specific rules. The trust, 3 names, 2 tiers, 1 clause. According to court documents obtained post-mortem, Rob and Michelle Reiner's trust had 3 primary beneficiaries. Tracy Reiner, Romy Reiner, Nick Reiner. But they weren't treated equally, not by a long shot. Tracy, the eldest and most responsible, was designated as a successor trustee, meaning if Rob and Michelle passed away, she would assume control over all financial disbursements. Romy, the youngest, was protected under a legacy clause, ensuring she received an annual disbursement regardless of family conflict. Nick, his share came with conditions, strict ones. The trust stipulated that Nick must remain sober, maintain employment, and submit quarterly mental health evaluations in order to receive his portion, an estimated $14.5 million. Failure to meet those conditions meant his share would revert back to the estate and fall under the control of the acting trustee. Who is that trustee? Tracy. Let that sink in. If Nick failed to meet those conditions, whether by his own relapse or someone else's claims, Tracy had the power to redirect that money elsewhere. And just weeks before the murders, Rob and Michelle allegedly prepared to make that permanent. The will revision, a dangerous paper trail. This is where things get murky. In early March 2026, Rob and Michelle reportedly began the process of amending their will. Legal filings were started, emails exchanged. Witnesses say Michelle was concerned about escalating tensions with Tracy and Nick. Her plan? To appoint an independent third party, a lawyer outside the family, to take over as executor and trustee. She wanted to eliminate Tracy's power and give Nick's future a fair shot without it being subject to family dynamics. The paperwork, however, was not yet finalized, and that timing is crucial. Because if Rob and Michelle had died after those changes went through, the control Tracy wielded would have vanished. But they didn't. They died just days before the documents were scheduled to be signed, almost like someone wanted to stop it. The suspicious signature. Here's where it gets even darker. Among the documents recovered after the murders was a signed draft of the revised will. But something didn't add up. A handwriting expert retained by the prosecution noticed inconsistencies in Rob's signature. After analysis, the expert determined a high likelihood that the signature was not authentic. Was it forged? Was it staged to make the will look valid? If so, by whom? Tracy's attorneys immediately denied any involvement. Nick, when questioned, claimed he didn't remember seeing it before. But there's one more twist. The signature on that revised will matched a sample found inside the envelope Tracy allegedly delivered to Nick 2 days before the murders. Coincidence? Or damning proof? Tracy's financial moves before the murders. Investigators also discovered that Tracy had made unusual financial maneuvers in the month leading up to the tragedy. She opened 2 new accounts under a corporate shell LLC, both in Delaware. She transferred over $500,000 in consulting fees from a family account she managed as trustee. She met with 2 attorneys, one estate specialist, one corporate litigator, and she allegedly told a colleague at her film production company, "Things are about to shift. Big time. Just watch." All of this occurred weeks before Rob and Michelle were killed. And when questioned about these actions in court, Tracy invoked the fifth, 5 times. Nick's journal entries. The money's not for me. Let's revisit Nick's journal for a moment. Because sprinkled among the delusions and cryptic lines were clear references to the estate. One entry read, "She told me it's not about the money. It's about who controls the future." Another, "They want to lock me out. I'm the liability. She's the empire. They picked her." And perhaps the most damning, she said if I did this, I'd be safe forever. No more tests. No more proving I deserve to exist. It wasn't just financial fear. It was existential. In Nick's mind, money meant validation. Control meant security. And Tracy, allegedly, was dangling both over him like a carrot on a stick. Was that manipulation? Was it delusion? Or was it a setup? The prosecutor's argument. During opening statements, the prosecutor laid it out simply. Nick Reiner was not a monster. He was desperate. Desperate for approval. Desperate for security. And desperate to matter. And someone, his sister, used that desperation like a weapon. She didn't have to hold the knife. She only had to point it. That theory didn't just electrify the courtroom. It shook the Reiner family legacy to its core. Because it painted the murders not as a breakdown, but a transaction. Cold, calculating, deadly. And just when the prosecution thought they had their angle locked in, Romy Reiner took the stand. And what she revealed would rip the entire case wide open. What if the only person who saw it coming was the one no one ever listened to? She wasn't in the headlines. She wasn't on the red carpets. And until the murders, Romy Reiner had largely stayed out of the Reiner family drama. But that all changed the moment she walked into the courtroom. Because when Romy took the stand, hands trembling, voice cracking, the quietest member of the Reiner family became its most devastating witness. And what she said not only reshaped the case, it shattered everything we thought we knew. Her testimony wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. But it was precise, painful, and, perhaps, the most believable thing anyone had said since the tragedy began. Because Romy wasn't just a witness to what happened. She'd been warning about it for months. And no one, not one person, had listened. The forgotten Reiner. Romy Reiner, 27, had always been the artsy one. The daughter who didn't chase the spotlight. The Reiner kid who lived on the edges of the frame, just slightly out of focus. She studied photography in college. Took up journaling instead of filmmaking. Worked odd jobs in design, gallery installations, nonprofit arts programs. She never gave interviews. Never walked premieres with her father. And she almost never posted on social media. But don't mistake that for ignorance. Because Romy saw everything. And in her silence, she was watching the family burn from the inside out. Romy's statement, "I told Mom. I told her." Romy's 911 call was the first seismic moment in the case. But it was her court testimony that would haunt everyone who heard it. Wearing a black blouse and jeans, with no makeup and her hair tied back, Romy took the witness stand. And for the first time, the jury heard from the only Reiner child who wasn't directly accused or implicated. Her voice broke as she started. "My name is Romy Reiner. My parents were Rob and Michelle. And my brother killed them. But he wasn't the only one responsible." There were gasps. Tracy flinched. Nick looked down. And then Romy continued. Romy's account of the final month. According to Romy, the last month before the murders was worse than ever. She visited her parents' home twice in that window. Each time, she said, the air felt thick with tension. She testified. "Nick wouldn't look at me. He barely spoke. Tracy was around constantly. Always whispering to Mom, checking papers, having closed-door conversations with Dad. I asked if everything was okay, and Mom just said, 'It's complicated.'" Then Romy dropped a bombshell. "1 week before they died, I asked Mom point blank if she was afraid of Tracy. She didn't answer, but she cried." She paused, looked at the jury. "That's when I knew something was wrong. Deeply wrong. The warning no one took seriously." Perhaps the most gut-wrenching moment came when Romy read a message she sent to her father on the Wednesday before the murders. "Hey, I don't want to interfere, but something's off with Tracy and Nick. Please don't leave them alone together. Especially not with Mom." Rob never responded. She followed up with a text to her mom. "Please hear me on this. I think something is going to happen. I don't know what, but I feel it." Michelle replied with a heart emoji. That was the last time Romy ever heard from her mother. Romy and Nick, a sibling relationship in shreds. Romy described her relationship with Nick as loving at first, broken by the end. She admitted to idolizing him when she was younger. He was the funny one. The one who could make me laugh when Dad was being serious and Tracy was being intense. But she said things changed when Nick's addiction worsened. He became erratic, aggressive, and worst of all, he stopped seeing me as his sister. He started calling me the observer, like I was some kind of threat, like I was watching him for someone else. Who did he mean? Tracy. According to Romy, Nick believed she was spying for Tracy. He said she told him I was weak, that I'd turn on him like everyone else, that I'd lie in court if it came to that. Tears rolled down Romy's cheeks as she said, "I never wanted to testify against my brother, but I have to, because he did this. And Tracy helped him believe it was justified." Romy versus Tracy, the confrontation. Perhaps the most intense moment in the courtroom came when Romy was asked to identify Tracy. She looked across the room, straight at her sister, and said, "That woman right there manipulated my brother into killing our parents. I can't prove it on paper, but I watched it happen. I saw her poison his mind. Slowly, strategically, and I hate her for it." Tracy remained expressionless. No tears, no flinch, just cold silence, as if expecting to be blamed. Romy turned back to the judge. "I don't want revenge. I want the truth. And the truth is, we let this happen." The private audio clip. Then came something no one expected. Romy had recorded a voice memo on her phone 3 days before the murders. It wasn't meant for court. It was meant for herself. A kind of personal diary entry. But when prosecutors heard it, they knew it needed to be played. In the recording, Romy's voice is hushed. Urgent. "I just left the house." Tracy was whispering to Nick again. I couldn't hear what she said, but he looked so broken. He was crying, shaking, and she just stood there, watching him, like she wanted it to happen. The courtroom fell silent. You could hear people holding their breath. Because in that one clip, everything shifted. It wasn't evidence, but it felt real, raw, unfiltered, and terrifying. But what happened next in court would take Romy's words from emotional to explosive. Because during cross-examination, Tracy's lawyer asked a question no one expected, and Romy's answer left the courtroom in absolute chaos. Can someone be made to kill by the one they love most? It's a question that haunted the courtroom during the Nick Reiner trial. And it's a question that will haunt you as well. Because while the world saw a tragic son, trembling and tearful, confessing to murder, the defense, and parts of the prosecution, raised a chilling possibility. Nick may not have acted purely of his own free will. Some argued he was manipulated, coerced, controlled, groomed for violence. Others dismissed it as delusion. A tortured mind creating an imaginary puppet master. But what the evidence suggested was far more complicated. This was not just a murder. This was a psychological battlefield. And the architect of it, according to Nick, was Tracy Reiner. The subtle art of coercion. Psychologists call it coercive control, a form of emotional manipulation that doesn't leave bruises or blood, yet is just as destructive. And experts testified that this form of control can be so powerful, it alters a person's sense of reality. They start believing threats, lies, and manipulations as truth. They can feel trapped, powerless, and desperate, all while thinking they are acting on their own volition. In Nick's case, his journals, his voice memos, and even his behavior patterns suggested he may have been under this influence for years. Consider this entry, written 6 months before the murders. Tracy told me they're all against me. She said I have to act before they erase me. I don't know if I should, but if I don't, they win. It's a mindset eerily consistent with what psychologists describe as induced obedience, where the victim becomes an agent of their manipulator's desires. Courtroom experts, parsing Nick's mind. Dr. Dana Lurie, the forensic psychiatrist called by the prosecution, testified that Nick displayed signs of high suggestibility. He is emotionally dependent, impressionable, and desperate for approval. When someone he trusts exerts influence, he follows it, even if it conflicts with his own moral compass. Meanwhile, Dr. Victor Hammond, hired by the defense, elaborated on the concept of brainwashing in domestic contexts. We often think of brainwashing in cults or military scenarios, but coercion in families can be just as powerful, especially when there's a lifetime of emotional manipulation. Individuals like Nick may commit acts they believe they chose, when in fact they were led to it. The jury listened in silence as both experts dissected Nick's mind. Could someone be convinced to kill their own parents? Could manipulation really reach that point? Patterns of psychological manipulation. Throughout the months before the murders, investigators pieced together a timeline of interactions between Tracy and Nick. Repeated check-ins late at night, often lasting hours. Emails filled with threats disguised as advice. If you can't handle it, you'll have no choice. Gifted objects that served as emotional triggers, like photographs of the parents paired with scrawled warnings. Praise followed immediately by criticism, keeping Nick off balance emotionally. Psychologists testified that this is a textbook method of conditioning, reward and punishment in cycles that heighten anxiety and dependence. Nick's own words supported it. In one journal entry, he wrote, "She smiled at me when I obeyed. She frowned when I questioned. I live for her approval and die for her disapproval." The line between influence and coercion was dangerously thin. The role of isolation. Isolation amplifies manipulation, and Nick had been increasingly isolated. Living in the guest house, rarely seeing anyone besides Tracy, separated from friends and colleagues, and under the constant gaze of his family's internal surveillance, Nick had few external anchors to reality. Neighbors reported seeing him wandering the estate late at night, speaking to himself. Staff noted he had stopped attending therapy sessions on his own and only did what Tracy insisted. Psychologists argued that this isolation made him more susceptible to coercion and less able to critically evaluate his sister's influence. The envelope, a psychological trigger. 2 days before the murders, Tracy allegedly delivered a sealed envelope to Nick in the guest house. What was in it? Possibly the disputed will. Possibly something else entirely. Nick's journal references it repeatedly. She brought the envelope. Said it was proof. Said they were going to erase me. I had to act. I don't know if it's right, but she said it was necessary. Prosecutors argued that this envelope wasn't just paper. It was a psychological weapon. It's the classic method of coercion. Provide evidence, real or imagined, that validates the manipulator's narrative and pressures the victim to act. Red flags, signs of psychological entrainment. Court testimony highlighted several behaviors consistent with extreme manipulation. Hypervigilance. Nick monitored Tracy's every move. Emotional dependency. He sought her approval before making any decision. Distorted moral judgment. He believed murder was necessary to prevent erasure. Confabulation, mixing reality and perceived threats, often citing Tracy as the source of orders. These are not isolated traits. They are the hallmark signs of coercive influence. Jury reactions, the battle of sympathy and doubt. Inside the courtroom, the jurors were visibly torn. Could someone truly be manipulated into committing murder? Or was this simply a young man rationalizing an impulsive act? Should Tracy be blamed indirectly, or was this entirely Nick's responsibility? This tension kept the trial gripping and the media captivated. The question of coercion turned every witness into a potential piece of a psychological puzzle. The aftermath of mind games. Whether Nick was manipulated or not, the damage was done. 2 lives lost. 1 family fractured beyond repair. A public image of the Reiners, once untouchable, now stained by allegations, journal entries, and psychological warfare. But perhaps most chilling, Nick himself believed he had no choice. And that belief, coerced or genuine, was what allowed him to commit acts that no sane person should. And the next twist? Evidence soon emerged of missing security footage from the Reiner estate. 14 crucial minutes that were deleted or erased. Who tampered with the cameras? Why? And what secrets did those missing minutes hide?